All right, well, welcome. My name is Jeff Snipes, and I'm going to be your moderator for the next 50 minutes. You are sitting in the Future of Employee Engagement panel, and we have an esteemed group of leaders in the field up here this morning, and I'd like to just quickly go down, let everyone introduce themselves so you know who you're speaking with.
Hi everybody, I'm Ben Granger. I'm a consultant at Qualtrics, so I help organizations implement a variety of different employee listening mechanisms. And just very quickly on Qualtrics, we provide software as a service, survey platforms for organizations to collect actionable data from the market, from their customers, or from their employees.
I'm Keith Kitani. I'm the CEO and co-founder of GuideSpark. We're a technology and content company focused on helping organizations improve their employee communications to help connect employees to the programs and services of the organization.
Morning, everybody. I'm Mike Bergelson. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Everwise. We have a software platform that helps enable organizations to deliver learning experiences at scale that drive real behavior change.
Hi, everyone. I'm Raphael Crawford-Marks, co-founder and CEO of Bonusly. We are a platform for employee recognition, rewards, and growth.
Good morning. My name is Wendi Walker-Schmidt. I'm the Director of Engagement Solutions for Learning for Inspirus. We're a Fort Worth-based rewards and recognition company, and we focus on the employee experience.
So the subject of the panel this morning is, what is the future of employee engagement? I'm sure in the world that we live in, you're comfortable with the idea that traditional performance management, employee engagement techniques are under fire. The world is looking towards technology solutions today to automate the process. But I think there's a big question in the air around, are we automating an old paradigm? Does performance management actually drive engagement? What does inspire and engage and retain talent today? Is it truly an automated system, or is it more of a human factor that we seem to have gotten away from over the years? So I'm going to start off this morning with just a couple of questions around engagement as a concept. Do we really know what engages employees in the workforce? What do we think actually works before we get into hyping a particular solution? What have we seen that actually does drive engagement and retention in the workplace? I'll just open up to anybody who wants to comment.
Well, I think we do have a fairly good idea of what employee engagement is and what drives it, though in business it seems like what business doesn't always match up with what science knows about how to engage employees and what makes us feel good about our work. And business tends to think in terms of inputs and outputs, and so money is the input and work is the output, but that's not how humans operate. And so a more nuanced understanding of human psychology is really necessary to fully engage your workforce.
Yeah, when I think about employee engagement, it's I think there's a lot of definitions about employee engagement, and I think the one I always use is kind of an emotional connection to a company, right? And that's really kind of a feeling. And so I think the challenge is, how do you measure and how do you track and how do you improve like a feeling or something that's kind of an emotion? And I think that's something that is going to be really interesting to see how, you talk about technology and other things, but I think you can use technology, but it also does come down to the people and the employees and the managers that are going to affect that kind of feeling.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of these points. And in fact, when you look at some of the older original definitions of employee engagement, when you look back at Kahn, when he talked about meaningful work, these are still things that the research bears out. The same things that we thought drove engagement a few years ago, or even 30 years ago when this construct was created or thought of, are still some of the same things that predicted today, with some minor differences, and I'll talk about it at a different point. But a lot of the same things, people feeling that they're doing work that's worthwhile, they're doing things that are interesting, they are able to grow their career. These are all things that matter to the majority of employees and promote engagement. And when they're not in place, they promote disengagement. And of course, relationships with other people are a big one, and that's very closely tied to the emotional connection that Keith talked about. So their relationships with other people within the workplace, including their leader, is a big driver of employee engagement. So again, I think the original definitions are coming back today. A lot of the same things are true today.
I guess I would, if I'm the roundup here, I would say three things. People want to do work that matters. They want to be recognized for that, and they want to continue to grow. And this is especially true for folks who are early in their careers. I mean, we know that growth opportunities matter more, and learning opportunities in many cases matter more even than the cash that we put in people's pockets earlier. When you get past 35, starting to think about legacy and things like that starts to become more important. But it's doing work that matters, getting recognized for it, and growing.
And I would absolutely agree. I think, there's varied definitions with regard to employee engagement. And so, we try to focus on the employee experience, which I think hits on everything that you guys have been talking about. And it's making that connection with hearts and minds to drive that culture of high performance. And I think that's what's very important when we look at engagement.
So are you all finding that there's a significant difference in today's millennial generation? Is the younger workforce today engaged by a different set of factors than a midlife or later stage workforce?
I would say no. I haven't seen any. I work with a lot of organizations that run a variety of analyses on the engagement surveys within their organizations. I haven't seen a whole lot of evidence to suggest that there's that generation is responsible for that. I actually think it's some of the differences that we see when we see them, which is rare in my opinion, are really driven by what stage they are in their career versus the fact that they were born a certain year. So I'm not, I'll stop there.
Other opinions?
I know we talk a lot about millennials because they're becoming the biggest population in our workforce, but for me, and I heard a panelist talk about it yesterday as well, it's not about a specific generation, it's about all employees and all employees getting that good feedback and making sure that we're connecting to that meaningful work and creating those relationships with them.
One of the things that I think about is that is possibly generational is how you engage them is going to be different. I think the way you engage a millennial versus a baby boomer is going to be different. They may still have the three things that Mike talked about in terms of what they're going for, but how you engage them, I think, is different based on the generation they're involved.
I'm just going to build on the first comment. I worry about the notion I worry about us talking about the millennial generation and assuming that we know anything about the millennial generation. I mean, by definition, we're reducing things that we know about an entire generation when we do that. I mean, if you take age out and you insert ethnicity or skin tone or gender into the what do we know about, it doesn't feel right. So we just, I think, need to be really careful when we reduce. It's important to think about, are there trends? I do think people who were born into some of the technologies with which we're now familiar, there are going to be some differences in how people communicate, in willingness to share, things like that to my generation might seem a little bit different, but I was the slacker generation, and I've been accused of a lot of things. Being a slacker is not one of them. I mean, the sort of person who was the archetype of my generation, I think, was Kurt Cobain. And it was sort of like, oh yeah, I don't have a lot in common with him, so it's a little bit dangerous for us to look at some sort of squeaky wheels and say, gee, that defines an entire generation. Having said that, what can we do? We should look at each person, and I know this is an eye roller, we should look at each person as an individual, and the solutions that we think about should recognize that each person has a specific background and a specific set of ambition and potential, and to the extent that we can design experiences for folks that honor those differences and don't sort of brush them under the carpet because we generation wash, I think that would serve us well.
So performance management has been a staple of HR systems for 40, 50 years. It's a standard in most large organizations. You every year prepared for 360 review of your performance. You sit down with your manager, you get feedback. Oftentimes you get a rating. Sometimes it's tied to compensation. Does this work?
No. I mean, sorry, but it doesn't. I mean, we're here at an education conference, and I think for those of you who are familiar with education and learning theory, what makes a good teacher and a good learning environment? It's constant feedback. It's a blend of feedback that skews towards praise and not towards criticism. It's autonomy and empowerment, and a rich learning environment where people feel empowered to guide their own learning. We know all this about how humans learn, and yet as soon as they get into the workforce, we say, no, we're going to get rid of all of those ideas, and we're just going to give you once a year one piece of feedback, one evaluation of your performance, and that's going to be good enough to motivate you, to engage you, to help you improve. And it's head-scratchingly backwards. So no, it doesn't work for a variety of reasons. And I think some first principles needs to be discussed about what is the purpose of performance management. Is it to engage? Is it to help people improve? Because those are two different things that are achieved by different means. And annual performance reviews don't do either of them particularly well. But to get both of those, you need to do a variety of different things.
I worry a little bit that we blame process for a people failure. So good management involves giving feedback on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I had the luxury of hearing Lee Scott, who was for a time the CEO of Walmart, speak when I worked at Cisco, and he has Lee Scott's top 10 list of lessons that he's learned over his career, and one of them was he labeled "got a minute," and this was something that I don't remember who the chairman at the time was, maybe Sam Walton would do, but in every single meeting that these two gentlemen participated in, they would walk out and Lee would go back to his desk and he would know that the phone would ring within 5 minutes. And this guy would say, "Do you have a minute?" And he would go down to his office and he'd say, "I want to talk you through what happened in that meeting. Here's what went well. Here's where you missed an opportunity. Here's where so-and-so said something you needed to pounce, you didn't." So he was getting constant feedback as he went through it, the performance review process notwithstanding. So it seems to me, I worry a little bit that the performance review process, we say that's broken, but actually what's broken is management. And I'm not saying that managers don't have ambition, they don't want to be good managers, they don't know how to manage. If you know how to manage, you give people feedback all the time. The performance review is codifying what somebody should already know. I think it's important for us to have records, we know this to be true. Unfortunately, HR folks find themselves as stewards of the organization. They have to create a paper trail in some cases to avoid litigation and things like that. I mean, that's really what codifying the performance review process in my mind is all about. It's not about giving somebody feedback, that should be happening on a daily basis.
So let's assume that you live in an ideal environment where you have a wonderful manager and you're getting lots of feedback and you feel rewarded and engaged, your manager's doing their job. What then is the role of the system, of the performance management system, of feedback, of codifying, of capturing results, of documentation, of ranking employees? Is there a purpose for that type of a system in a well-managed environment?
I would say yes, but only to be used as a tool. I mean, I think if you've got a great manager who's doing that continuous feedback loop and giving you that performance feedback, you feel engaged, you're not leaving, you've got meaningful work. The performance system is just a tool, but I think that, and we are guilty as HR practitioners, I think that we have created as the entire system. And I think we need to take a step back and say it's a tool, but the performance management system looks a little bit different with regards to human connection.
I would also say yes to that. And I also think it's important for us to distinguish performance management and performance ratings, because those are not the same thing. Performance management is a lot of the things that you all talked about. The picture that Jeff painted was that typical rating process, which is a small part of a performance management process. So do I think ratings still have a place in organizations? Personally, I think they do, as long as they go in, as long as the other principles that we know about what drives human performance, what drives human behavior, constant feedback, constant interaction with your manager and your peers, those things are also in place as part of the overall system. And it's your system, you can't say our performance management system is our performance rating. You're bound to fail if that's the case. But if it's part of the performance management system, I think it can work.
Well, I think the issue is how you start to tie performance to compensation, right? That's one of the issues that you find with organizations is, it's been pay for performance has been something that people have talked about for a lot of times. But how do you take performance management and then maybe go to performance ratings, but then tie it to compensation? And how all those things work together can be a struggle for organizations if they just focus on the performance management, right? Improving. But at some point in time, each organization does have to give a raise or something. I mean, you have some companies that are doing some innovative stuff, but in the end of the day, that's where it leads, and that's where, how do you tie performance management to actually the raise you get? And that's where I think that idea of the manager and how they communicate and how they connect with their employee is so critical. So you can put a process in place for all of those things, but you can't take out the people, because the people are the ones who help the employees interpret and understand where that all fits in for them personally.
Yeah, look, I think software helps people do what they should be doing. It's when we try to replace what people should be doing in the world of management with software that we get in trouble, because that's when, I don't know, how many reminders do you guys get from like your Fitbit telling you to get up? I mean, past a certain point, I'm just like, stop, it's enough already. You know, the software can't dictate my life, and the software shouldn't sit between me and my manager. I need my manager to grok the fact that when she gives me good feedback, it feels good and she gets more performance out of me. And when she sits down and listens to me and we work on goals for me, whether they're OKRs or development goals, professional development goals, that she's actually getting me to lean more into work and she's creating a roadmap for me to grow in the organization. That she needs to fully understand that, and if the software can facilitate that, fantastic. If the software is trying to nudge people to do things, or even worse, to do it for them, like I worry at this moment that I think that's misdirected energy.
So some of the software that you're alluding to today is available that is often, it's essentially an extrinsic rewards management system. It sets up goals, expectations, rewards, bonuses, pats on the back, points. What is the appropriate weighting to give to extrinsic rewards, whether it's compensation or something else, as a part of engagement?
It really depends on the work that's being done. Extrinsic rewards in a modern kind of white-collar, knowledge-based workplace where people are solving novel problems and working on teams, intrinsic motivators really don't work. You want to ensure that everyone is fairly paid, right? You want to make sure that you're looking at market compensation and making sure that everyone is fairly paid. But then beyond that, what you should really be focusing on is fostering a sense of purpose among your employees, empowering them, allowing them to feel like some sense of autonomy and control over their workplaces, and facilitating connections to their peers, and facilitating continuous feedback. If you have a segment of your workforce or all of your workforce doing more rote work, which a lot of that's going away because of automation, but if you do, that's where extrinsic motivators can really help improve performance, because if you just need to crank out 60 widgets per hour, well, if you get bonuses for cranking out more widgets, that's going to increase performance.
I would also say it's a little bit off, but being careful about what you incentivize. One of the things that I see in sales environments often is we'll put financial or extrinsic rewards around outcomes, which makes a lot of sense in sales environments. But what behaviors are you incentivizing? And so a kind of a odd example, but one that really illustrates the point is I'm from Louisiana, and in New Orleans we had a big problem with Nutri-Rats. And if you don't know what that is, they're really, really ugly, like huge rats, and they clog up the sewer systems. And so the parish in New Orleans, Greater New Orleans Parish, put a bounty on Nutri-Rats, thinking that, okay, if you kill a Nutri-Rat, you get $20, and so this will help solve the problem, right? We put an extrinsic reward around this target. But what they didn't think of was what people started to do was create little farms of Nutri-Rats. And there's a similar story about cobras in India that many of you have heard of. So be careful, in those cases where extrinsic rewards make sense to give, be careful about what you're rewarding and make sure that you're rewarding the right behaviors in addition to the right outcomes.
So looking at this conversation around extrinsic rewards, compensation, just putting a fine point on it, should compensation be connected to your performance review and your feedback amongst your peers? Should there be some sort of a bell curve or a rating or a ranking that has a compensation element tied to it?
This will be a fun one.
I think we're all looking at each other for an
I'm
answer at this
I'm not a
point.
compensation expert. I mean, look, it seems pretty straightforward. I want to be rewarded for good work. I think what I worry about is if the compensation discussion obfuscates a discussion about performance in areas where I can improve, and all I want to focus on is my bonus. I think that's why at Everwise, when we have designed our compensation to be at a different time than the formal performance review, simply so that those can be isolated conversations, because otherwise compensation tends to cloud out something that is also super important. But I think for a lot of people, having compensation tied and knowing that there is a direct reward for doing good work is really important. I'm not sure why those things would be totally unrelated.
Yeah.
And I would absolutely agree. I'm a big proponent of divorcing comp and performance in that realm. Don't have the conversations at the same time. I think that's real important. You know, high-performing organizations, if you're having those continual conversations with your employee, that performance appraisal pretty much writes itself at the end. There's no surprises. I know that if I've been having these coaching conversations with somebody all year and they've been struggling, well, their compensation's going to reflect that, But if they've been doing really well, we've been giving them strive, stretch, and reach goals, and they've been outperforming that, again, their compensation should reflect that as well. But I agree with you. I'm a big proponent of having those conversations at different times. Otherwise, I'm not listening to a word my leader is saying. All I'm wanting them to do is get to the end and tell me, what does my compensation look like?
I mean, look at the converse. Maybe the converse is instructive. If in a case where there's no connection between performance and compensation is totally random. That doesn't feel right.
Right.
So maybe that's the answer. Maybe the converse teaches us that there should be some connection between those two.
And that makes me think of when we look at the academic literature and you look at procedural justice versus distributive justice. So the idea that the outcome that I didn't get a raise, I'm not happy about that. But if the process I perceive as being fair, I'm going to be okay with that. So procedural justice in these cases trumps distributive justice. And so if there's a process that feels fair, that usually is in line with a meritocracy, at least in the US, I would agree. I think that's a problem. Now, one thing you mentioned, Jeff, was forced distributions. I'm a strong believer that that doesn't work. And we've known for a long time in the research that forced distribution performance management systems don't work. So now the interesting caveat to that is people are a lot better at making relative ratings versus absolute ratings. So I'm going to be more accurate at saying, how does Wendi compare to Keith versus how does Keith rank on these, or how does Keith score on these competencies, and then how does Wendi rank on these competencies? So that's a bit of a caveat, is that people are more accurate at that, but forced distribution performance management systems often don't work.
But then how do you drive consistency? I mean, I think one of the challenges that you have as an organization scales, if you at some point in time, you have to be able to have consistency across the organization. And I think that's one of the challenges, where you can say nothing is perfect, but you still have to have some type of a manner or process to go across. And that's where the challenge comes. Right.
I mean, scale and consistency those are the impetus for a lot of the systems we're talking about, right? If we had small teams, lots of human connection, very intimate, we know each other well, you don't have a lot of the need for these, right? The reason we have a lot of the software systems and processes is because we're talking about tens of thousands of employees in many organizations. They have legal requirements on liability issues and so forth. So, how do you find a balance between this, fostering human connection, which seems natural and ideal, with the reality of how do you manage this on scale of thousands of people?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge increases, but it is doable. We can point to companies that do it. So Google's a good example. They've invested a lot of time and resources into their HR department, which they call people, and that people department has a people analytics section to it that studies how best to manage people and how best to engage them, how best to facilitate growth, and they put a lot of effort into training new managers and providing evaluation to managers about how they manage, so that even as they've scaled to tens of thousands of employees, they have in individual teams and sections, they have really high quality managers fostering connections and providing feedback in real time. And so it's hard, but being very intentional about creating an environment that prioritizes providing a sense of progress and development to employees, providing a sense of purpose, and providing a sense of autonomy to employees can scale up. You just have to, at each stage of your company's scale, kind of ask those questions anew and say, okay, what people, processes, and software do we put in place to make sure that we're still doing this the right way?
Yeah, I think there's one word to answer your question, Jeff. It's managers. It's management. Managers. And the thing is, people don't realize, Josh Bursons, I have to give him credit for this. He said this a couple months ago. He said, people get promoted to being a frontline manager, and it is a new career. And they don't realize it, and nobody tells them that. And so they're basically, if I said to you, Jeff, you're an investor, successful entrepreneur, all this great stuff, you're now going to be a nurse. You'd be like, okay, and you had no choice. Are you going to be like, great, are you going to show up and put on the outfit? No, you're going to say, I'm going to take some time to figure out what it actually means to be a nurse, because otherwise I'm going to do some harm. So nobody actually says, you are now in a new career, and here are the tools for you. It's actually worse. We kid ourselves and we kid them. It's like, oh, here's some videos you can watch. Really? Oh, but now they're 2 minutes long, so you're actually going to watch them. It's like, oh, okay, so now we're saying, like, you're going to watch these right? We're going to watch these 2-minute videos. You're going to learn to be a great manager. Here's a new career. Would you watch a series of 2-minute videos to become a nurse? I don't think so. It's a pretty hard job, and you have to actually go. What do? You practice. You walk around. Somebody says you're doing that wrong. The thermometer goes in the, like, okay, fine, but we are like giving our managers 90% of every one of your organizations, 90% of the people in your company, probably 92%, work for a frontline manager. Half of them don't know what they're doing. I have an idea. Give them some videos to watch and assume that they're going to become great managers. Like, the answer to this question is management. And managers manage. And we're saying, like, here's a book you can read, or here's a 2-day course you can take, and you're going to become a great manager. Like, please. You have to create an opportunity for people to practice management skills, and they will give good feedback. There will be no surprises when the performance review process happens. It'll be like, hey, as we've been discussing, we haven't seen the progress in this area, so I can't get you that higher level bonus. The promotion's not going to happen in the near term, but, like, we've got to continue to work on these things. When you have to part ways with somebody, it should not be a surprise. It often is. Why? Because the managers. So much of this comes down to the managers not knowing how to manage.
So without pointing your answer back to your own company, right, what solutions do you think are most critical for empowering managers to drive engagement?
I think just teach them the basics of being a leader. I think we do a huge disservice to people. They're a great salesperson, so we're going to say, you're a great sales manager. Not necessarily, because we haven't given them the tools to make that leap. There are some people out there that, intuitively, they know how to give feedback. Intuitively, they know how to be good coaches, but that's not everyone. And, I think throwing them in to the deep end of the pool, if you will, and say, here, you're a good leader now. We're not giving them tools to swim. And I think, we're doing a disservice not just to them, but to the people that they lead as well. And I think that affects, engagement and retention overall. And to me, it destroys the employee experience. Because I might have been a great salesperson, but now I am thinking I'm a horrible person because I can't lead this group of people, and that's going to permeate throughout. I'm a big proponent of, I love what you said a minute ago about getting that overall feedback, because I think that's so important, not just giving them a 2-minute video on here's how to coach your employee, but then actually putting them in that experiential learning situation where they can actually coach and get feedback, not just from their manager, but from their peers and their team members as well. Because I think that's so vital, and that's a scary part for people to be able to engage in, is to ask feedback on themselves from their team. But I think when they get that developmental feedback, it helps them grow and develop.
Yeah, I agree. I would add, once they are equipped, giving them access to data about their teams. So whatever employee listening mechanisms you have in place, whether it's your annual engagement survey or it's a variety of developmental assessments that go on throughout the year, allowing them to have access to that data once they're equipped, because if they're not equipped, that could actually backfire and make it worse. And also, I agree with your point, Wendi, about having a mechanism where the manager can get structured and unstructured feedback from their direct reports about what they can be doing better. And so those are two that come to mind immediately that I've seen can help equip managers to handle that kind of situation.
I think the challenge is there's no one answer. You know, I think the way you said it is like, what is the one or two things that you could do to fix that? And I just think that's close to impossible, right? I think in an organization, you have to do a number of things. You can use data, you can use managers, you can use, you know, I think we can all imagine what would be perfect. Okay, everyone's going to go and we're going to all build their skills and we're going to go through this process so they're going to learn how to be managers. But that's really not realistic in most organizations. And so how do you put together the different pieces that can contribute, you know, whether, again, data or managers? I think managers, I agree, it's a critical focus, right? But then it's kind of like, well, the chicken or the egg, right? How do you need a good manager to teach the manager? How many good managers are there? And how do you get the good managers to get the skills? And so I think companies have to all look at who they are, and they have to look at all the different pieces that are available to them and design it for them and for their employees. I mean, that's one thing for me when, you know, I like the word employee experience, but I really think it's about starting to really personalize or customize that experience for the company, the demographic, and the employee. And that's how you're going to start to build those right skills, because there's not one way to solve that problem.
The beauty of me having a jag around managers is it's really hard to argue that managers don't matter. I mean, I suppose somebody could take that side of the argument for fun at a bar one evening, but that's a hard one to argue. I mean, statistically speaking, 2/3 of you have left. I'm tempted to ask people to raise hands, but I don't know that we'd be able to see. But 2/3 of you have left a job because you had a crummy manager. We know people come to great companies, they leave crummy managers. We know this to be true. Ample evidence, manager. So the question is, how do you do that? Well, there is actually an answer. The answer is come up with a process that's durable. Come up with a process that doesn't assume that you come up with the answer, but actually assumes you don't have the answer. And I think, so this is going to be a bit of an odd response, but coming up with a process that brings your managers into the conversation. So you guys have all heard of design thinking. You're familiar with IDEO. You're familiar with the D School at Stanford. IDEO has popularized a process that Stanford is credited for developing. It's a simple thesis, which is bring your users into the room and ask them what their problem is. Gain empathy to what they want, what they need. Come up with a hypothesis. Would this work? Prototype, test, and rinse and repeat. And just keep going through that process. And you don't need, I mean, IDEO, they do great work. And they, you know, you need resources to support that. You can go into a room with people over lunch and just have a conversation with them. And the next day, you can have a learning experience in front of them. That will be wrong, but if you have the conversation the right way, they're a part of the process of testing. You've built in advocacy. And I think oftentimes we think, I need to go do an RFP and look at all these vendors and do this thing for 100,000. You don't. Just start small. Start with 10 or 15 people and see what works there. Build in some advocacy. People are going to think differently about you because you're inviting them into the dialogue. You're admitting the fact that what you're putting out there is probably not going to work, and you want the immediate feedback. And if you actually run that process will give you the answer. So the process is the answer in this case.
So looking forward, next 5 years, you are a general manager in a Fortune 1000 organization, and you're trying to decide what systems and tools to put in place to make your team successful in the form of talent engagement. What's your prediction? Where are the categories or areas of investment that you would be most aggressively investing in to have the right tools and systems to be supporting your people so that they have this type of connection?
So just clarification, you said you're a general manager, not HR.
Yeah, I think that we'll get to HR in a second. So this is, what is the line operator of a general manager of a division who's got employees? This is not HR yet. Talking about, all right, my job is bottom line performance results. I've got 1,000 people reporting to me. What are the tools that I want to make sure I'm investing in, the processes now, so that I get the culture of engagement that I want over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, investing in tools and systems is great. I would want to spend a little bit of time doing some more work around, hey, what are we doing in terms of training up managers and providing managers with support, and make sure we had some good kind of inclusive practices around that. But then, given that, looking at software and tools, tools that facilitate communication and feedback. There are a bunch of really lightweight ones out there. You want tools that facilitate, positive feedback between employees. You want to try to eliminate as much as possible, strictly hierarchical feedback mechanisms, because very often employees working on teams will know best who's doing what and be able to give each other better feedback. And then ways to then also get information to percolate upwards. So, engagement surveys of any form, and that can be as simple as Survey Monkeys in Google Docs or purpose-built tools. But it doesn't have to be fancy or expensive to do this. What really is required is that intention to get the feedback flowing in both directions and have a process to develop good managers.
I love the way you worded the question, which is why I wanted to clarify, because your question anticipates that in 5 years' time, human capital related systems will not necessarily be the purview only of HR. It suggests that some of the decision making will move from a central buyer, a purchase order, to a distributed buyer, credit card. So from a purchase order to a credit card. This is a path we've seen with IT over the last 15 years. If you'd had something like this 15, 20 years ago, as some of us know, you would not have been allowed to bring that into the organization now, and IT would have sort of played whack-a-mole and batted down things that you were trying to bring in. Now, of course, we know how that story in many organizations has evolved. I think the same thing may happen with some aspects of HR, where matters of personal taste, like some aspects of communication, some aspects of learning and development, will be taken over, not driven down to, but will be taken over by people who feel the pain of crappy systems. So I think those decisions will be made on the line. So anyway, I just want to acknowledge the way you asked the question was clever.
And we've seen that in the industry that I work in. We've seen that trend happen already, and I think that is increasing. My short answer to the question would be similar to another answer I gave, which is give employees a voice. Allow the managers need to have mechanisms that they can give their employees a voice. But in addition to that, and the critical additional piece is tools that help that frontline manager take action. So we talked about good management, assuming that all these managers are going to know what to do with the data and to take action. That's a bad assumption. So investing in tools to help me as a manager decide what the right actions are to take in response to the voice. Because giving employees a voice and taking no action or not communicating the action can actually damage engagement, damage performance. So it can actually backfire. So those two things have to be in place together.
Yeah, if I take a step back, with your question, 5 years from now, I think our ability to measure the issues around engagement, like I said, I think it's a feeling and emotion, and so there's not going to be one measure, but I think our ability to measure it over the next 5 years is going to be much stronger. And then that's where you got to start, whether it's feedback, whether it's manager training, whether it's the employee experience, whether it's communications, all of those things are going to have to really be driven around what are the key issues that organization has. Because I don't think there's one answer of one process is going to fix it for every organization. But you can start with a measurement and then start to really, I mentioned this before, I think it's starting to really personalize it for the company and the demographics of your employees and your employee itself, that you're going to start to drive engagement. Because the one size fits all, I think, is just not going to be as effective. One of the ways I talk about, or I think about it, is really moving to more an employee-centered view, right? Where companies have always taken a company-centered view of a program or a service or things and said, here's how the company is, take it. I think learning has been very, very much in that formal mode in the past. And I think that the transition, hopefully over the next 5 years, is as you start to be able to measure it and break down the different demographics and people, you can start to put the employee at the center of how am I going to engage that employee based on a number of different factors. And I think that's what I'm excited about. I think you can then personalize learning, you can personalize communication, you can personalize feedback. All of those things are going to be critical to changing how you're going to engage employees tomorrow.
There's I'm not an expert in the schools of choice movement, but I am aware that in some municipalities, some families are given vouchers and they can make a decision as to how they spend that money. And I'm certainly not in a place to comment on whether that works or not, but it is an interesting thought exercise. What if every company gave, let's say the average in the United States is on the order of $1,400 in L&D across everybody who's in the workforce. And let's say that skews a little depending on level and nature of work and things like that. So pick a fictitious company, Acme Widget Co. They have 10,000 employees. They spend on average $2,000 per employee for L&D. Let's just say they stopped doing that and gave every employee $2,000 that they could spend. Would they buy the experiences that the company has provided to them, or would they go somewhere else? I mean, I've worked at some big companies. I know my answer. So, and if the answer is they'd go somewhere else, then I think we need to ask ourselves the question, by definition, this has to be employee-centered, because the cost, the friction of moving is going down for many people, not for everybody, but for many people, the friction of moving is going down. So we have to do a lot of things to hold on to our folks. And if we believe that continued growth is part and parcel to engagement, and engagement is the panacea, well, then we need to actually provide continued growth opportunities. And if you say, hey, here's $2,000, spend it as you want, people aren't buying your Skillsoft videos or whatever, like, okay, that should teach us something about some of the decisions we're making.
So it sounds like, and I don't know if this is an actual trend you're observing or more of a hope, but I'm curious to push on this. You know, the rift between organizational performance and divisions and centralized HR is almost cliche, right? That the lines of business are focused on delivering results, and they feel like they're in the trenches and they know what they really need, and HR often feels a little bit disconnected, a little bit maybe slower to react to what the process, putting in place processes and systems. So are we actually seeing a fundamental shift that because of the, you know, movement towards employee-centric solutions and line-of-business-centric solutions, and anybody can buy and implement these lightweight HR, you know, communications device platforms simply? Are we seeing a fundamental shift in the role of HR, and what do we think their role, you know, should be?
Absolutely. You know, I've always said that we HR folk, we're people, you know, and then you've got the business, and they're operational focused. And sometimes when we get in the same room, it doesn't work out so well, you know, because we try to talk to them about people stuff, and they're like, oh, they talk to us about operational stuff, and, you know, we have the same reaction. But I think we can learn from each other. You know, I think that as HR practitioners, you know, we need to be able to dig more into that operational, those operational metrics and see how the business is running. But the converse is true as well. I think our business partners need to learn that people drive the business too. Take care of your people, results will come. And so I think that's lessons that we can learn from each other. And I think that's real important. As we're starting to look at chief learning officers and chief human resource officers, we're starting to see a blend of that role, but we're also starting to see a blend, but also kind of a divorce. We're starting to see the chief human resource officer become very operational focused, comp, ben, that kind of stuff. And then we're starting to see a new role evolve that's kind of that CLO, but it's also part of the human resource realm, the chief talent management officer. That's, you know, they look at that entire employee life cycle from recruiting, hiring, developing, and they look at the people part, but they also tie it back into that operational part. So I think that you're going to start to see a blending, if you will. I think we're all going to be able to sit at the same table and talk the same language within the next few years.
I think we're going to have to, or HR will eventually become obsolete. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the trend I'm seeing is, in addition to what you said, Wendi, the more focus on showing what are the operational outcomes of our people processes. And so, Raphael, you mentioned Google and their very robust people analytics team. These teams are popping up in many of the organizations that I work with where they haven't traditionally, where HR was mostly focused on administrative processes. Now they're hiring data scientists who are trying to show that the things that they do in HR, the training that they deliver, the measurements that when we make a change here and it impacts engagement, what does that mean to the operational business side of things? So without being able to show that relationship, I think HR is going to marginalize itself and push itself out of business and further away from the table that it is today. So they will, and the interesting paradox here is when you said HR is people, and HR needs to be an advocate of the employees. I agree with that, but that's an interesting issue because if they can't speak the language of the business and they can't show the relationship between what they're doing and the business outcomes, they're out. So how do they maintain, and I don't know the answer to that.
There's a conference called HRPS. It's a sort of the executive branch now of SHRM. And a man named Michael Arena, I think is his name, who's the chief talent officer, I think, from GM, got up on stage. And I'm saying this because I don't have the experience to say this, but he does. And he said, look, a lot of people in the current generation of HR practitioners came into HR precisely because they thought there wasn't going to be any math involved. Because they thought, gee, I get to help people. And guess what? This now is an industry that, if it's not yet dominated, will be heavily influenced by one's analytical skills. And so what we're finding is people who went into a field because they wanted to help people, and it was kind of like, look, I'm not that guy or gal who's going to be writing the software. But now what they're finding is, gee, those skills now are becoming not just important, but critical. So I think we're finding that there's a current generation of human capital practitioners that are kind of like, oh, and I worry less about obsolescence. I worry more about, you know, the recursive nature of HR saying, like, we too now are in a different job. We're in a different career. This is one that's going to be underpinned by data that's coming from people analytics, yes, but also there's something else that comes along with it. You know, in God, who is it, Deming, that said, in God we trust, all others bring data? So, like, you know, whatever CLO magazine, so I'm in the learning world, whatever CLO magazine says, I'm just going to do that. That makes no sense. That is an antiquated philosophy. There are data that can be gathered that can help drive decisions. We have to get comfortable with that. Practitioners have to get comfortable with that. The generation that's coming up is comfortable with that. So I think that will happen. I think it will happen more quickly in some organizations. We're seeing that, more slowly in others. I think some of the data, though, also, when you have trust in data, you can let loose some of the constraints on the innovation. So you don't have to control it all. You can let some of the innovation happen at the line. And you can say, oh, Sarah did something really interesting over there. Let me go in and see what she did and see if there's something that we can replicate. It doesn't all need to be driven from your COE. You can also learn from what other organizations are doing. Call up a head of human capital, a competitor. Compare notes. We see the best human capital leaders doing that. I talked to one of the human capital leaders from one of the top credit card networks, and I asked him about another credit card network. Yeah, I talk to him all the time. Now, they are arch rivals, but they are talking all the time about things that they're doing to help their people. So I think as we move towards data orientation, that will also change the way we think about where innovation happens. It doesn't need to happen right here. And then we'll have the seat, we, HR, will have the seat at the table that we've been talking about for 30 years, because we'll look like the rest of the folks at that table and relying on data for decision making.
Yeah, I think, though, there's still a challenge of being able to take the data and tying it to business results. Like, I think if you're in a line of business, you can look at sales, you can look at margin, you can look at things that are very easy to measure. Think about performance management. What is the business impact and ROI of performance management? I think everybody would say performance management is important. You want to develop and grow your employees, but how do you tie that to business results? Look at a perk, right? There's lots of companies that do perk. What is the ROI? How are you going to tie that with any kind of analytics to that driving your better bottom line or margin or even retention? And so I think that analytics will help us get there, but we have to realize that so many of the HR programs were not built on an exact measurable tie to the business. And so, like, that's the gap for me, which is we'll have analytics, and I think it's going to be helpful for us to design programs and processes and technologies to help, but still trying to really get it to that seat at the table, like the way you might have in a line of business is going to be a gap. And that's, for me, going to take time. Because I don't think anybody's going to say, okay, let's get rid of all performance management, let's get rid of all of our benefits. But if you asked how is that actually driving our profitability or our business metric, it's hard.
Yeah, but look, I mean, you see when you drive up 101 in the Bay Area, you see the billboards, right? So there is a marketer somewhere who convinced his or her leader that doing that's a leap of faith, that doing that is actually going to yield results. Not everything needs to be measured. It seems to me if we drive meaningful behavior change in our managers, we're going to see good business results. I don't feel an urgency to show that inextricable link between those two things. I think even in the boardroom, people will take leaps of faith that if you do certain things, outcomes will come.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we're going to, like I said, we're not going to throw it away. Right. But if you're going to then compare an investment in that versus an investment somewhere else that is more measurable, right? If you talk about the seat at the table, it's like, which investments do you want to make? That's where I think there's going to be a challenge. Because data is going to get us partway there, but there's still a long road to actually.
Number one line item in most companies is still salary. So just lead with that, and human capital has a seat at the table.
So we're going to run out of time. We've got 1 minute left. All right, so closing thought. What will change the most in human capital engagement in the next 5 years? Just one phrase.
If you're not growing, you're going.
Yeah, I think decentralized experimentation, decentralized tools that empower employees and divisions to do things rather than having centralized decision making is going to be more and more common.
Taking as a given the fact that employees will choose what matters to them and not being dragged to that inevitability, I think, is an important strategy for human capital practitioners to adopt today.
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned a few times, I think it's the idea of an employee-centered approach, an employee-centric approach to how you're going to engage your engaged employees.
And I would say, think of people processes as living, breathing things that should and may need to change over time. What you put in place today may not look the same in 3 years or 5 years, and probably shouldn't.
Fantastic. Well, that concludes our panel. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to our guests for.
Thank you, Jeff.